picture this. September 25th, 1066. A single Viking warrior stands alone on a narrow wooden bridge, his massive axe gleaming in the morning sun. Behind him, 300 longships filled with the most feared warriors of the North Sea. Ahead of him, the entire English army, hungry for revenge. This one man is about to hold off thousands of enemies in what would become the stuff of legends. But here's the twist that will shock you. This epic last stand would actually mark the end of over 2 centuries of Viking terror. The dream of northern conquest was about to be shattered forever. But how did the Vikings, who had struck fear into the hearts of Europe for generations, meet their ultimate doom on this single English bridge? Stay with me, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the fall of the Viking Age. Let me take you back to 1066, a year that would reshape the entire course of European history. The English throne was up for grabs, and every ambitious king from Norway to Normandy wanted their piece of the prize. But none burned with desire more than Harald Sigurson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, literally hard ruler, the last great Viking king. This wasn't just any ordinary monarch. Harald Hardrada was a living legend, a giant of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. He had served as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, fought in the Holy Land, and earned a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe. His very name struck terror from the fjords of Norway to the monasteries of Ireland. Now, imagine over 300 longships cutting through the gray waters of the North Sea, their dragon-headed prows slicing through the waves like sea monsters awakening from an ancient sleep. Each ship carried 30 to 40 of the most battle-hardened warriors in the known world. These weren't just raiders anymore. This was a full-scale invasion force, the largest Viking fleet assembled in decades. But Harald wasn't sailing alone. By his side stood Tostig Godwinson, and here's where our story gets really interesting. Tostig was the brother of Harald Godwinson, the current King of England. Yes, you heard that right. This was going to be brother against brother, a family feud that would determine the fate of a kingdom. Tostig had been exiled from England and now sought revenge against his own sibling, willing to invite foreign invaders to settle his personal score. On September 20th, 1066, the Viking storm finally broke upon English shores. The first clash came at Fulford Gate, just outside the ancient city of York. The English forces, led by the northern Earls Edwin and Morcar, thought they could contain this northern threat. They were catastrophically wrong. Picture the scene. Thousands of warriors clashing in the muddy fields outside York, the clash of iron on iron ringing across the countryside like thunder. The English fought bravely, but they were facing warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. The Vikings had traveled thousands of miles, not for gold or glory alone, but for land, for a kingdom, for a legacy that would echo through the ages. The battle was a massacre. The English shield wall, that famous defensive formation that had protected England for generations, crumbled under the fury of the Viking assault. Earl Edwin and Earl Morcar barely escaped with their lives, their armies scattered to the winds. York, one of England's most important cities, fell without another fight. But here's what makes this victory even more stunning. The Vikings didn't just win a battle. They captured an entire kingdom. They took hostages from York's leading families, demanded tribute in gold and silver, and essentially held the entire north of England ransom. Harald Hardrada wasn't just raiding anymore. He was conquering piece by piece, building his English kingdom with each victory. The Viking dream seemed unstoppable. But 185 miles to the south, another herald was about to prove that the age of Viking conquest was over. When the news of Fulford Gate reached King Harold Godwinson in London, he faced an impossible choice. His brother had betrayed him, the north was in enemy hands, and he had just received intelligence that William of Normandy was also preparing to invade from the south. England was about to be torn apart by enemies from two directions, but Harold Godwinson was no ordinary king. This was a man who had earned his crown through battle, not birthright. He made a decision that military historians still study today, one of the most audacious forced marches in medieval history. In just 4 days, Harold moved his entire army 185 miles from London to York. Think about what this means. In an age before roads as we know them, without modern logistics, carrying full armor and weapons, these men covered nearly 50 miles per day through mud, rain, and exhaustion. They slept in fields, ate what they could forage, and pressed forward with a determination that bordered on superhuman. But here's the tactical genius of Harold's plan. He wasn't just racing to save the North, he was gambling everything on the element of surprise. The Vikings, drunk on their victory at Fulford Gate, had no idea that the English king was bearing down on them with the speed of a lightning strike. By September 24th, Harold's army had reached the outskirts of York. The Vikings, meanwhile, had moved to Stamford Bridge, about 7 miles east of the city, to collect more hostages and tribute. They were celebrating, feasting. Many had even left their armor behind on their ships, thinking they were safe in their conquered territory. They couldn't have been more wrong. Dawn broke on September 25th with a crisp autumn chill, but the morning calm was deceptive. As Harold Hardrada and his warriors gathered at Stamford Bridge to collect their tribute, they had no idea they were about to fight for their very lives. The site itself was strategically perfect. A narrow wooden bridge crossing the River Derwent, with open fields on both sides. The Vikings controlled the eastern bank, while the English approached from the west. What happened next would become one of the most famous last stands in all of medieval warfare. Picture the moment when the first English scouts appeared on the western hills. The Vikings, many stripped down to just tunics in the warm September sun, suddenly realized they were facing the full might of the English royal army. Panic rippled through their ranks, but these were warriors who had sailed across the North Sea for conquest. They weren't about to flee without a fight. Harold Hardrada, the giant king who had conquered from Constantinople to the Arctic, began shouting orders, trying to form the traditional shield wall that had served Vikings so well for centuries. But they were caught completely off guard, scattered, many without proper armor or weapons. And then came the legend that would echo through history. A single Viking warrior, whose name is lost to time, took his position on that narrow bridge. Armed with a massive two-handed axe, he faced down the entire English army alone. For precious minutes, he held the bridge, cutting down every English warrior who tried to cross, giving his comrades time to organize their defense. The chroniclers tell us this lone warrior killed over 40 English soldiers before he was finally defeated. But how he died, that's a story that shows both the honor and cunning of medieval warfare. An English soldier floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and thrust his spear upward through the wooden planks, mortally wounding the Viking hero from below. With their champion fallen, the bridge was breached, and the full fury of Harold Godwinson's army poured across the River Derwent like an avenging flood. What followed was not just a battle, it was the violent end of an entire age. Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, fell early in the fighting. pierced through the throat by an English arrow. Tostig Godwinson, the traitor brother, died fighting beside his Norwegian ally, choosing Viking honor over English blood in his final moments. The irony was bitter. In seeking to destroy his brother, Tostig had destroyed himself. The battle became a rout. Vikings who had struck terror across Europe for over 2 centuries found themselves hunted like animals through the Yorkshire countryside. Some made desperate stands in small groups, others fled toward their ships, but Harold's men were merciless. This wasn't just about defeating an army. This was about sending a message that would echo across the North Sea. The age of Viking conquest was over. The slaughter was so complete that of the 300 ships that had brought the invasion force to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home to Norway. Think about that. Over 90% of the greatest Viking army ever assembled was destroyed in a single afternoon. But here's the tragic irony that makes this story even more compelling. Harold Godwinson's greatest victory was also the beginning of his doom. As King Harold stood among the bodies at Stamford Bridge, savoring what should have been the triumph of his reign, a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. William of Normandy had landed on the south coast. The Norman invasion had begun. Harold's army was exhausted, depleted, scattered across northern England. Many of his best warriors lay dead beside their Viking enemies. And now he faced the impossible task of marching back south to face another invasion, another army, another fight for the crown of England. The Battle of Stamford Bridge had saved England from the Vikings, but it had also fatally weakened the kingdom, just when it needed strength the most. In 3 weeks, Harold Godwinson would lie dead on the field at Hastings, and England would fall to Norman rule. But here's the question that haunts historians to this day. What if Harold Hardrada had succeeded? What if that lone Viking warrior on the bridge had held just a little longer? What if the Vikings had been wearing their armor that September morning? We know from the chronicles that Harold Hardrada was negotiating with other European powers, planning to make England the center of a vast northern empire stretching from Ireland to the Baltic Sea. The implications are staggering. No Norman conquest, no French influence, a completely different trajectory for English culture, language, and history. Some historians argue that Stamford Bridge was more significant than Hastings itself, that it was the true turning point where the old Viking world died and the new medieval world was born. The bridge where one warrior made his last stand became the bridge between 2 ages of history. The story of Stamford Bridge reminds us that history often turns on the smallest moments. A single warrior on a bridge, a king's desperate march, a brother's betrayal. These weren't just battles fought with swords and shields. They were,